Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. I am Alasdair Mac Roibeirt. I reside in the barony of Glenmere in the Kingdom of Ontario, and this is the second class in a series that I'm doing on starting camp furniture, but at the same time also expanding your tools collection and buying as you need instead of going out and stocking up. I have seen a number of people that decide they want to get involved in woodworking, and they will go out and they will buy a large quantity of tools at first, make a huge investment, only to find that half the tools they don't actually need, or they're not the right tools for what they're trying to do. So this class and the ones like it are aimed at getting you the information to build a project and the tools that you need for the individual project as you go. This is the second class. This will be a class on a breakdown bench. Our first class was on a 6-board box and covered basic differences in saws for doing your preliminary and final cutting, different options, and relying on what you already have at home or giving you an idea what you'd need to buy. Um, the end of that class, I introduced this one, and we talked about making a breakdown bench. The breakdown bench that we talked about doing was this one here, which is a fairly typical style found not too uncommonly in a lot of different places in the 15th century. Uh, After the class, in retrospect, I actually decided to do a modification, and instead of doing this one, we're instead going to go with this one. It's a little bit different. For one thing, instead of changing up and going over to dimensional lumber on the other bench, this one is going to stay with the same 1 by 12 by 8-foot pine board, just like we used in the last class of the 6-board box. Um, so we're not using anything new. We're getting familiar excuse me, a lumber that you're already familiar with. So So first off, we'll cover the tool portion of this. As I said, the basic idea on this one is to get you familiar with a chisel, or maybe reintroduce it to you if you haven't used it for a while, and give you an idea of what to look for if you need to buy it. In general, if you go to any big box store to buy a chisel, what you're going to end up with is called a bench chisel. It's going to look a lot like this one here. Usually there's going to be a metal cap on it. You'll have either a rubber or a hard plastic handle on it. And when you look at the edge here, you'll notice it is beveled, not just the angle, but also the sides are beveled here. It's kind of a general all-around workhorse chisel used for a lot of stuff. Um, you can find them just about anywhere. Like I said, Home Depot, Lowe's, Ace, Maynard, any of those that you happen to be at. You can also find them a lot at yard sales or at places like the Habitat for Humanity Restore. It's a good all-around chisel. The other kind of chisel, it's a broad category, is called a mortising chisel. And while it's a metal chisel, there's a couple of differences to it. One, it doesn't usually have that bevel on the sides. Two, it's a much thicker cross section. The idea here is it is for prying out pieces of wood. It's called a mortising chisel because that is pretty much exactly what it's made for and all that it really does. There are a few other kinds of chisels that you'll find. Usually they get bigger. You see it into things like this one here. This is more of a framing chisel. It's more used for large scale construction. You notice the size of the blade. This is a 1-inch chisel. This is, I believe, a 1 5/8 inch. You're not going to have a whole lot of use for these, but it's kind of interesting to know about. You get into some really big chisels that are about 3 inches wide or 2.5 inches wide, and those are purely for construction or occasionally for debarking trees. For processing lumber, it's usually called a slick, and it's for making very, very large chops for framing type construction. Not something most people are going to ever have a need for. They're just kind of cool to look at. One of the other things that you look at when you're getting a chisel like that, these two both look really similar. They both have that beveled side. They both are standard length, but you'll notice that the one here is significantly longer. It also has just a plain wooden end on it. The reason for that is this is a paring chisel. It is not intended to be struck, whereas most framing chisels are intended to be used in conjunction with a mallet. With a paring chisel, it's all in the hand. You're going to place your chisel on top of your workpiece and use it to slice off to get a flush bit. You'll take off small pieces of dowel that are protruding from the top a bit, or if you've got a dovetail or a tenon that's a little bit proud of the surface, that's what you're going to use a paring chisel to slice it nice and clean. Whereas a bench chisel has usually either a reinforcing ring around it or will have a solid cap on the end of it, and that is intended to protect the chisel when you're hitting it with a mallet. The idea with the mallet is for control. So once you clamped your workpiece down so it's not going anywhere, if I'm here with just my hands and I'm pushing as I go, I can hit spots where the grain will catch the chisel and it can pull it off to the side. But more importantly, as you go and you encounter resistance and you put more and more pressure into it, you can then shoot forward. And my nice, even slice off the edge now becomes a great big chunk taken out of it. Whereas by using the mallet, I'm delivering a specific amount of force, and it's a short, controlled burst, which tends to make for a much smoother and easier line. I can also eyeball it as I go, and if I'm taking too much off, I can change the angle of my chisel a little bit to take a little bit more or a little bit less off of it. One thing to keep in mind is usually it's a really good, well, not all. When you determine what mallet you're going to use, almost universally you'll find wooden mallets. You don't find metal mallets being used. They're a lot heavier. You're also damaging the end of your chisel a lot more. That metal on metal or the metal on wood will cause the wood to broom out. You can break the handle of your chisel. There's also a lot more mass, and it's a lot more tiring for your hand to have that big mass of metal that you're moving around. Wooden chisel or a wooden mallet tends to provide a good amount of mass, gets good power in there. It's a good medium ground. Some people I know have used dead blow mallets for it. I've also seen people use rubber mallets. I'm not a big fan of rubber mallets. They do have a tendency, in my experience, to mark the wood if you're close to it. And they also rebound a lot more. So it's just not my preference. Plus, with a wooden mallet, it's something else I can make myself and put a bit of more personalization into it. So, the bench itself. This bench does not have a whole lot of moving parts. It is going to go together purely by friction. There are no pegs or dowels that holds it together. And once you put it together, it'll stay together by gravity. It consists of a top with through mortises, which connect it to the legs. Excuse me. A couple of stringers or stretchers, depending on the terminology you use, which will hold on to the legs and also act as additional support for the top. And then the legs themselves. Now, if you haven't done a whole lot of woodworking or looked into it a whole lot, you've heard me mention mortise and tenon, and that might be kind of a confusing term for you. So in essence, a mortise and tenon is a tab and a slot. A mortise is a hole in wood. More often than not, it is square-sided and either square or rectangular. And the tenon is merely the tab that sticks up and goes through the mortise. Sometimes you'll have what's called a blind mortise, where it's just a hollow. It doesn't go all the way through. Have a through tenon, fairly self-explanatory. It goes all the way through. It's also useful for things like if you're doing a pegged bench like the other one. That's what that tenon goes through, and the peg will lock the whole thing together and make it nice and sturdy. So in this case, as I said, we're using a 1 foot wide or 12 inches by 1 inch thick by 8 foot long pine board. This is again, just like in the last class, easily accessible. Most of your big box stores. This one came from my local Home Depot, cost about $20. So it's not going to break the bank. It is not as sturdy as a hardwood is going to be. It is a softer wood. Keeping in mind the term hardwood and softwood, if you're not familiar with it, does not refer to the actual density and damage resistance of a piece of lumber. It actually refers to the characteristics of the tree. Um, Most softwoods are actually evergreens, firs, pines, things of those nature, cedar, whereas most hardwoods are deciduous trees. They lose their leaves in the fall. Oak, maple, things like that. Now, that is not to say that a softwood isn't going to be fairly hard. Just because it falls into one of those two general categories does not actually define the characteristics of the wood. You can have a hardwood family of piece of lumber from the hardwood family that is actually very soft. So but when we say hardwood, that's what we're generally referring to. So in this case, it's pine. It is a softwood in both senses of the word. Pine is got a fairly nice smell to it. It is fairly light. It is fairly cheap to get, um, but it does not work quite as nicely as a hardwood will. Um, you have to be careful of dents and chips taken out of it. Not a whole lot more, but it is something to keep in mind. So, with that being said, first thing we're going to do with this project is we are going to go through and we are going to lay out the legs. So these are the legs for the bench. I'm going to go ahead and lay out for another lesson. This particular bench is 4 foot long, obviously 1 foot wide, and is 18 inches tall. When I say it's 1 foot wide, I should also point out that the dimensions of the lumber are nominal. It starts out as a 1 inch thick by 12-inch wide board, and over the process of finishing it, of thicknessing it, of jointing it, it actually gets taken down to a nominal size, and the finished size on these is much closer to a 3/4 inch thick board by 11 1/4 inch wide board. The 8 foot is actually fairly accurate. Again, measure that though, and don't just assume. Sometimes it can be off by as much as a half inch or even an inch. Usually to your benefit, but occasionally not so. So as I discussed in the previous class, in the six board class, when I'm going to the lumber store, when I'm going in, I am looking for a few things in my boards. I'm looking for them to be as straight as I can get them. I am looking for them to be flat. I don't want them to have any cups or twists or any weird warps to them. Uh, if I have knot holes in it, which you can pretty plainly see with this one I do, I'm looking that the knot hole is tight. There are no cracks in it. It doesn't wiggle around or anything like that. It's in there. It's a pretty solid fit, and it's not likely to go in there and weaken my project down the road. I am also looking to check the ends to make sure that there are no splits or cracks in the ends that are going to affect my project later on. The boards that I bought for this class actually surprised me. I picked them up at the store. They looked pretty good. I got them in the car, and the difference in temperature and humidity between the house and the car, I don't know if you can see this from that angle, but you'll see there's a nice big split right here and a split right here. This one here goes back a good 8 inches. So that actually is going to affect what I can do with this board, but there's not a lot I can do with it. Sometimes you just get a bad board, cut around it, and hope for the best. When I budget for my lumber, I generally add about 20%, give or take, depending on the board, of excess just for mistakes and unexpected things like, well, the end of the board splitting. So I've taken one of my boards and I've cut it down. So now I've got my 4-foot top. One side's a little dirtier than the other. It's the way it came. And then I've got my two 18-inch tall legs. Now, normally, if you are doing a project like this, you're going to think about the finished height of your project, in this case, 18 inches, and you're going to figure out how it's going to go together. You might not actually be the height that you're expecting for those finished legs. The 6-board box, the finished height was 18 inches, which meant that we cut these legs actually at 17 1/4 due to the thickness of the top sitting on top of the board. Since this is a mortise and tenon, that means that the tenon on these legs are actually going to go all the way through to the top. So you will see these on the top of that board. So they will stay the same height. Now, for my layout, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to look at my board. I'm going to worry about it. There is a certain amount of movement in the wood. And if you can see the grain here, you notice it's consecutive rings. That is from the growth of the tree. And you can also notice there's a pretty definite warp to this particular board. If I put it down on my bench, I can wiggle it a little bit. It's not quite as severe as it looks on your screen. The camera tends to magnify that a little bit. But if I put it down on the other side, it's pretty flat. For this kind of project, that isn't so much of a concern. Things like the 6-board box where you're gluing sides together, it does make a bit more of a difference, but you can kind of work around it here. I do, however, generally prefer to keep that grain going in the same orientation. And when I say that, what I mean is I want both legs to react the same way if possible. Um, I don't want one leg bowing out if it warps and the other leg bowing in. So if I've got that particular case, I want both of them to bow out. So in this case, I'm actually going to put them together so they're like that. You can see the grain goes against each other so that as they start to move, it's going to kind of bow out a little bit more. It's less likely to damage the stretcher that goes underneath. I've talked before, wood is just like that. Wood is made up of long fibers. And those fibers are hollow. It's usually what the sap flows through, nutrients through the tree. Once the tree has been cut down, it's been dried, usually in a kiln. All that's driven has dried up. So those fibers are now hollow tubes. You can kind of think of your board as a collection of long straws. It's really important when you get to laying out your material and thinking about how things are going to move and how they're going to work on you. In this case, as you can see here, when I'm cutting down in here, I'm actually cutting through those fibers, which means instead of that long strength that they've got, now it's just got those weak side bends. And this one wasn't shown earlier, but if you can see here, that crack opened up because of stress in that board. It's just part of the nature of the beast. I didn't sand it enough, so it was a little too tight in there. And then when you saw me struggling with this at the opening of the class, I actually cracked it a bit. It can be fixed, and it can be done relatively easy, and it can be done relatively easy to conceal. On this particular one, after the fact, I'm going to go through and I will probably grab a drill and I'll chuck a 1/4-inch drill bit into it, and I'm going to drill down into the uncracked portion of it, past the damage. I will open it up a little bit, squeeze some glue in there, and then I'll put a dowel through the thing and clamp it to dry. That'll actually strengthen it. And not only will that repair the damage, I'll probably do it to all of them since pine is so soft, and that'll give me a much stronger joint. Not something they really would have seen in period, except perhaps as a repair. However, you wouldn't usually find a bench made of such a soft wood in period, at least not that would have survived. It would have long since rotted away. So I've got my boards. I've decided which way is going to be in and which way is going to be out. The other thing I'm looking at is the surface, both for aesthetics. In this case, I've got a knot right here I've got to worry about. This side is much rougher. It's a little harder to see. You can kind of see the discoloration on the sides here. There's also a scuff across it. That means I'm going to have to clean that out. Normally, I'd go for the other side, which is much cleaner, hasn't been damaged as much, but I want that curve towards the inside, so I'll have to deal with that there. It is not uncommon if you look at period furniture to find that the undersides of things or the interiors are a good bit rougher than the exterior, the side that you would normally see. Not a whole lot of reason to put time and effort into prettying up a portion that nobody's ever going to see. It's just a waste of time, and time being money, they wouldn't have spent the time on it. So for my board, I've decided which side I'm going to go on. In this particular case, I want that knot as far away from the top as I can. As you can see with this one here, we're going to be doing a lot of cutting up here. So that knot holes always represent a potential sign of weakness. I'm really not crazy about how close these are to those mortises, but there's not a lot I can do about that. I just kind of have to go for it. So in these, I'm going to want both of these to be so that the knot holes are on the bottom. Once I'm determined that, I'm going to grab my pencil, if I can figure out where I put it, and I am going to make a note to myself that this is the outside face, and I'm going to put an arrow on it pointing up to tell me where I'm cutting, so that if I happen to set this aside, go do something else and come back, I don't just grab it, jump right into it, and realize, oh, I cut the wrong side. So for my mortises here, those will be cut later. I will actually cut my mortises based off of the size of my tenons. They're not, it's much easier to to enlarge the mortise a little bit more if it's too tight for the tenon than it is to figure out a way to add something to the tenon if the tenon actually ends up a little bit smaller than the mortise is. For my layout here, with a mortise and tenon, generally I want to have, if it is a through mortise, through tenon, excuse me, I want at least 2 times the amount or the thickness of the lumber left on the outside. On the previous bench, I've got that dowel there, which means that is, as those boards are 1.5 inches thick, I want at least 3 inches of tenon sticking out after I've drilled that hole. Since these are just going to be to the top of the board, we don't have to worry about that so much. So coming in here, I am going to begin my layout. First off, I'm going to find the center of my board. And measuring these, I am at 11.25, which means that my center of my board is going to be 5 5/8 inches down. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to mark that spot. And I'm just going to put a line right down the middle. That's the beginning of my board. I want my tenons to be at least double the thickness of the board wide, so they're nice and strong. They're going to have plenty of material in there. They're not going to snap off. So this is a 3/4 inch board. Means my tenons need to be 1.5 inches wide for my personal preference. They don't go directly in the middle. I want to have a bit of a gap here. So on that one, I just kind of arbitrarily decided I was going to make it a 1 inch gap to either side for a 2-inch total gap in the center. So I'm going to go in here again. I'm going to mark where I want my boards. So I have now laid out my center cut that I'm going to be making. From here, this is where I am going to now be coming in, and I am going to be doing where my actual tenons go. Now I'm using a pencil here primarily for easy visibility over the internet. Usually I would prefer to use a marking knife. And a marking knife is a pretty simple tool. It is just a flat-sided blade. It is only beveled on one side. I kind of get you to see that one there. This one has suffered a little bit of abuse. I dropped it at one point and broke the tip off. But the really nice thing about this is it will lay flat on the board. And it will also lay flat so that bevel is going into it. It gets you right up against your line. So for my preference, I'm going to use my marking knife to lay it out instead of the pencil, but that doesn't show up very well over the internet. I'll go back through and I will mark these as I go with the knife. The other nice thing is The marking knife, especially going across the grain, will actually score the fibers, and it will reduce the amount of tear out to help make the lines look a little bit prettier when you're going through and doing your cuts. So as I said, I've now got my center section here, which will be staying put, and then on either side, I've got my tenons laid out. Now, as I showed here, there is also a couple of depressions here. Those are where the stretchers are going to sit. They actually come down half the thickness of the stretcher, half the thickness, so that the stretcher sits evenly with the top of the board where this area is here. So that will give a nice good bit of support to the actual seat of the board, so it doesn't bow in the middle, because this is some fairly thinner stuff. It's pretty stiff, but a little bit of extra support on there, especially with, you get some of our people who are not always the most careful with their furniture. Fully armored fighters coming off the field, flopping down onto the bench, things like that. I tend to be a fan of over-engineering, sometimes to the point of ridiculousness for everything. So to make these cuts, I'm going to take my stretcher, which I've determined is going to be 4 inches wide, and I'm going to cut half of that distance down from where the top of this board is going to be. Since these tenons are going to stick up 3/4 of an inch, that means that I need to measure down from the end of my board 3/4 of an inch for the tenon, and then an additional 2 inches. So my line will then be at 2 3/4 inch for how far down that tab is going to go. Now, I'm using my speed square for this. It makes things so much nicer. It's a 90-degree angle. I've talked about them before. One thing I should point out is that when you're doing that, keep the same side as your reference line as much as possible. Theoretically, the board is parallel and perfectly straight. In actuality, wood moves. It never stops moving. So it's not always going to be the same. You may end up with a board that is exactly 12 inches on one side of your 4-foot seat, and it could be 11 and 15/16 on the end. Not a big deal, but it's off just a hair, just enough that it'll make some of your measurements a little wonky. So by staying with that board, that one side, you'll know that your line should be parallel and everything should align pretty well. So I've gone down my 2 inches, my 2 3/4 inches. Now that I've stopped and talked, I'm not entirely certain on that, so I'm going to go through and measure that just to make sure. Yes, I'm at 2 3/4 inches. So now my board is 3/4 of an inch thick. So I need to now come over here and I need to move this over by 3/4 of an inch. To allow for the thickness of that board. And I'm going to come down here and I am going to mark it off. So now I've got a whole bunch of lines up here. Now, for the next thing, I need to mark off my top to figure out exactly how much I want to take off. And since the tenons need to stick through to the top of it, the easiest way to do that is actually to take your board, take one of your legs and lay it on the top so that it lines up evenly with the end of the board here. And in this case, you can do that by feel. Your fingers are going to tell you usually if you've got a nice close to the edge, if you are right on, if you're a little under, much more than your eye will more often than not. So I'll get that there, and then I'll just grab my pencil. I'm going to come into the other side, and I'm going to make a mark. So we've now got that line right there. Now, these benches are not usually, when they're found, as plain as we're going to make it just for this class. There's a lot of room for embellishment. A lot of the ones that you'll find have a good bit of decoration or fancy cut work, carving, things like that on it. In this case, I'm just going to cut mine down just a little bit. As you can see, I've taken some off here. Again, I'm going for the lazy route. I decided I wanted a 4-inch foot going up from the bottom. So I measure up 4 inches from the bottom. Make a line across, and then once again I'm going to take one of my boards And I am going to use that, and I'm just going to give that as an arbitrary number for 3/4 of an inch to take that off. So if you can see all those lines there, there's now a lot of them. Now here is one very important step to do before you go any further, especially if you're working and you're not able to do everything all at once. There's a whole bunch of lines here. They go in different directions. It doesn't always necessarily tell you what you're taking off and what you're not. And if you accidentally cut the wrong section, you've now got to not only relay it out, but you've just wasted that material. So I go through and I will go and I just use a series of X's, and I will mark off everything that I know I am cutting off so that I know what to leave behind, and I don't find myself abruptly in the situation that I've cut off too much and now have an unusable board. There's people do different ways. I know some people just do a squiggly line. Some people use different colored pencil. Uh, I just use a series of X's. It's quick and it's easy, and it shows me exactly what I'm taking off and exactly what I'm leaving here. One of the other benefits of using a marking knife versus using a pencil is your lines with a pencil are the thickness of the pencil, which means you could be off a 16th or even more, depending on how thick that pencil is. Um, and it's a trade-off. A thinner pencil lead, like a mechanical pencil, will actually give you a thinner, more accurate line, but it's also more difficult to see. And since especially we're using pine here, it's a soft wood, that thin pencil lead can actually cut into the wood a bit and then follow the grain of the wood. So you might actually get some unequal or uneven lines in there, some distortion. A thicker pencil is going to avoid some of that, but it also is not as accurate. So when I'm cutting this, one of the first things I'm going to do here is I'm going to make sure that whenever I'm cutting, I am always cutting to the waist side of the line. So when I'm looking at this one here, where that X is, that is the waist section. So I want the blade to be inside here so that when I am done cutting, I will actually have a little bit of that line left. It means you're going to have to do a little bit of cleanup afterwards, which is also conveniently enough where a chisel comes in, because you'll take that out and that will help you fine tune your fit for your mortises. So we've talked about a bunch of different types of saws last time. We talked about table saws and band saws and jigsaws and all kinds. Depending on the saw you have, some of this is going to be a little bit trickier than others. I have, for this particular one, I have my bandsaw back here that I'll be using to cut them out. It's quick and it's easy. The downside is it doesn't turn very well. It does have a good turning radius, but you can't make a 90-degree turn with it. So I'll have to make a couple of different cuts for it. My first cut, when I'm going through here, I'm going to look at my cuts and determine what needs to take out and when. So in this particular case, when it comes time to take these long side pieces off, I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to make that shortcut first. The reason for that is you never want to back your piece off of your saw, especially a power saw, while it's running. And a lot of times you'll find that the blade will be really tight in there. You can pull your blade off of your bandsaw and have to reset it. Sometimes you'll break smaller blades like jigsaws or scroll saw blades, depending on what you're using. But it also makes it much easier when I now go to do this long cut. By having this short little cut in here, I know that's where I stop. It also will come off completely, so I don't have to back that saw this entire length here. I only have to back it off about the thickness of the saw itself. Makes it a lot easier to do and also a good bit safer. So to cut this center section out, there's a couple of ways you could do it. The simplest way is to go ahead and to cut in with whatever type of saw you're using and cut it to just before the line where you're marked. And as a demonstration of that, So you should now be able to see there's a couple of thin little cuts there, and it's a little hard to see with the lighting here, but I'm actually a little bit inside. I've got pencil on both sides, and I haven't quite hit that bottom line. Now there's a couple of different ways that I can go about doing this to remove that center piece. I can grab my chisel, and I can set it up in here so that I am, again, a bit forward of the line. And I can start working my way down to the center of it. In this case, I've got my bandsaw, so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to start at one corner, and I'm going to work across, and I'm going to take out a wedge-shaped chunk. Just like that. As you can see, I came down fairly far. Then I'm going to go back, and I'm going to do the other side. So now I've taken out a good bit of it, but it's not all the way there. I could possibly go in and work my way down with the saw, but now we're getting into inefficiency. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to take my square, I'm going to line it back up with my line, and I'm going to use the edge of it. You can kind of see here, square actually has a foot there. It sticks out on both sides. So I can use that to mark on the other side here to transfer my line all the way around so that the whole thing should now be marked down there, and it should be parallel. And that gives me an idea of where I'm cutting. I'm now going to take my chisel. I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to place it closer to the edge than to the line. Pine is very soft. It does not cleave as nicely as a hardwood does, so you have to take it in smaller bites or you'll get a lot of tear out on there. But I'm going to set my chisel there. I'm going to give it a couple of whacks, and I'm just going to take a bit off of it. And then I'm going to move back a little bit more and take a bit more off there. Once I've worked that down, I still don't want to quite be at my line, but once I've worked it down so it's fairly close, and I've been kind of taking it a bit of an angle. I don't want to go straight down. I want just a bit of an angle in here. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to do the same on the other side. And I'm going to work my way back to the other side. I'm going to take a little bit more off. Until now, you should be able to see there's a definite difference in height between those two sides. This side is fairly close to the line. This side still needs to have a little bit more. At this point, I will match it on the other side, bring them both back down to about the same, and I can do one of a couple of things. I can either grab a file or a rasp, and I can start working it across the center, because since I've gone in for both sides at a slight angle, I have a bit of a peak in the middle, which, in theory, if you use a file and keep it flat, you file that down, and it should get to both sides are parallel, and you should have a 90-degree joint in there, or at least close enough to work. The other thing I can do is I can grab a paring chisel, and if I'm very careful, I can start working my way and taking a little bit off. Not my preferred method to doing it. When you're cutting across end grain, it really raises the possibility of splitting the wood, and it just doesn't cut as neatly. The softer wood wants to tend to fold and mush over, so it's a lot easier to do it with a file if you've got it. But a chisel can be done, or you can use a flat edge piece of wood with a piece of sandpaper glued to it and get in there and sand that down as well. So once I've done that, I'm going to effectively do the same thing for all my cuts. I'm going to go down where the stringers go. I'm going to get there. I'm going to do my sides. The sides will be the easiest. I can take a little bit off of both sides and then rip it right down, and I'm good to go. Once I'm done with these, for my personal use, I'll probably do a little bit more of embellishment on them. One of the things is you do not find too many of these benches that have a solid foot like this. It's a stable platform, but if you're on uneven ground, such as, at a park or a campsite, it's usually a lot easier to find four relatively stable areas, small areas, than it is to find two stable, flat, long areas. So I will take a little bit off of them, much like on this one. So I've now got these 2 feet here. Whereas if I've got a single long piece here and I happen to have a rock in the middle, my bench is going back and forth. I've now got a couple of feet. I can straddle that without a problem. You'll also notice that I've got these curves cut out here. Again, personal aesthetics, you've got a lot of material left over in this board that you can play with, that you can do to your own personal taste. Take a little bit more out, make some decorative cuts in and out, make some nice curves, cut some feet and all. I don't generally like on my projects, I don't generally like to do a 90-degree angle like that. It makes for a weak point, it makes for a stress point. So normally with something like this, I'm going to either cut or plane it down so that there's a bit more of an angle to it, or I'll cut it with a curve when I cut it, just so it's a bit stronger and it's a little more pleasing to the eye for me. Once you've got both of your legs cut out and you're good there, your stretchers are going to be cut exactly like you cut the slots for them in the legs. You're going to go in, you're going to cut up your 2 inches, you're going to cut it out, and then you're just going to chisel out that little bit of waste in there. That one you're going to want to play with just a bit. You might need to sand, you might need to chisel just a bit. You want it so that this piece on the end and the top of this board and this centerpiece are all in the same plane. Might take a little bit of finagling for you. You might have to cut a little here, cut a little there, but it's going to be something you should do it in increments. Take off a little less than you think you might need. It's better to make 2 cuts than it is to cut too much. So it sits nice and flat and it's sturdy and holds there, and you don't have a problem. If you cut a little too much on one side, sometimes the seat can actually start to rock a little bit on the tenons, and you really don't want to do that. You want equal support all the way around. Next up, we have the mortises. Now, for the mortises themselves, we're going to be cutting those in, and we're going to be using the template that we've made in the shape of the legs that already exist. So for this particular one, I've got a 4-foot board. I want my tenons and mortises to be in there far enough out that there is plenty of material so that if the top starts to rock a little bit, that tenon doesn't become a lever and pop loose a section of the board. Similar to I showed you on that one there with the stretcher where that came loose, you can actually have that happen on the end of the board, even if it's a hollow in the center where it can push that whole section out. Again, you can dowel it if you prefer, makes it a little bit sturdier, but with something this long and wide, it generally has a bit more. For this particular project, I went with 4 inches in. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to take my board, I'm going to take my square, I'm going to figure out how long it is, I'm going to mark that. I've got 4 inches, I'm going to mark that. And then again, I'm going to grab one of my pieces and I'm going to mark it. For this, you might actually want to use the legs before you do the cutting on them, when you do your layout, just because it's a little easier to do them when they're all on one plane than it is when you've got a chunk taken out of it. It's still eminently doable. They're longer than the leg. It's just a little bit easier to do it that way. So now that I've done that, I've now just got a series of pair of parallel lines on there. Now, once again, I'm going to grab my speed square. I am going to put it back to my line, or lines actually, and I'm going to mark it so that I can take that over to the other side. Now, the reason for that is that when I'm cutting my tenons out, I don't want to just go completely through the wood. The problem with doing so is if you're not careful, you can blow out the other side. You're going to be using a mallet, you're using a chisel. It's very easily to tear the last 16th of an inch, 32nd of an inch out and make a large unsightly hole on the side. It's easy enough to fix if you actually do that, or actually to hide if you do that by just making that the underside of the board. But if we can avoid it, so much the better. So I'll go ahead and I will set that there. Then I will use my legs and I will line them up on the board, and I will actually trace my tenons that I've cut in here. Again, I'm going to mark with X's what I'm taking out of here. See that? Now, keeping in mind what side of your tenon that you use to mark. There can be minor differences. You might have cut a little bit more on one side, you might have cut a little bit more on the other. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to basically grab it and slide it under and then flip my board so that I am using it the same reference on both sides. And since I referenced closest to me on the other side, I'm going to reference farthest to me on this side. And I'm again going to mark my tenons. So what I should have here, if I did all this correctly, is both sides of my board I've now got the marks on, which is important because now I've got to start going through the board. In this particular case, first thing I want to do is I want to score it. Like I said before, I've got my marking knife. I'm going to go ahead and use that. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to get on my line and I'm just going to very gently, this is a very soft wood, bearing into it too much can really easy to just go wing it off into somewhere else and you don't end up with that straight line. But I'm going to go over it a couple of times gently to kind of score the wood where I'm going to want to start cutting out those tenons. I don't know how well this will show, but let's see. Now, if you can kind of see, it's a little bit darker in that area. It's kind of hard to see, probably not so much. If you don't have a marking knife, you do have a chisel, which works just as well. I'll take my chisel, I will place it on the line, and I will give it a light tap. Not a lot. I just want to score the surface to mark where my lines are going to be for my tenon, or for my mortise, excuse me. Of course, I have a 1-inch chisel, so instead of moving my 1/2-inch chisel 3 times, 4 times, it's much easier to just grab it. So I've now marked all the way around. Your chisel has got a flat side and a beveled side. So I'm going to take my flat side and I'm going to place it just past the halfway line so that I am closer to the side of the opening than I am to the middle. And I am going to take just a little bit. So that what I've got now, if you can see that, is just a little bit of wood taken out. Not a whole lot. I want to work my way gradually to that line. Softer woods do not generally work well with taking large amounts of wood out at a given time. So I'm just taking a little bit, then I'll move it back a little bit and I'll take a bit more. I will come back to my initial mark on the line. I'll deepen it a little bit so that it frees the chips that I'm cutting. So that at this point, Should have a pretty noticeable depression going on there. I don't want to go much more than about halfway through the board at this point. I'm going to take that chisel, I'm going to flip it around, I'm going to start working on the other side. And I'm taking just small little nibbles. I'm letting the chisel do the work for me. I'm not trying to take it all out in one shot. Now this does a couple of things. One, it makes sure that you're coming in here and you're keeping this edge fairly square, because I'm going to the line, I'm working my way down it, and I'm not putting any pressure on the outside edge of that mortise. I really want to keep that as square as I can. This is soft wood, and as that tenon goes in and out, it's going to have a tendency to flex back and forth and round it out over time. But I want to keep it as square as I can, as long as I can. One of the other things is the wider the mortise that you're taking, the smaller the cut you need to take. If I'm doing a 1/2 inch mortise, I can actually hog out a bit more material each pass than I am with the 1 inch. I've got the same amount of force directed into a smaller area, so it's actually a bit more effective. So now I've gone through several times, and you can see I've got material taken out on both sides. Now I'm going to flip it over, and once again, I am going to score the edge of my mortise. And yes, I know it's silly, I always double tap. And then just like on the other side, I'm going to take out some. And against what I said earlier, I'm actually just using a bit of muscle to cut those last little bits there instead of using a hammer. Sometimes it's just quicker that way. So now, both sides of my mortise look somewhat like this. They have a section in the center. They're pretty close to breaking out. I'll continue to work that back and forth until I have that center section gone, and then I'll go through with my chisel and I'll carefully, as we did with the top of the board, work my way back until I've got a smooth cut and it's a parallel cut. Now, this is one way of doing it. There are a bunch of other ways you can do. Some have more or less work to it. So it depends on the tools you have. I have a really nice handy tool under my bench here called a hollow chisel mortiser that does nothing but cuts square holes like this. But it's about a $300 machine, and that's all it does. And I don't do a whole lot of mortises anymore. It's just quicker for me to do it by hand for a couple of them than it is to pull the thing out, set it up, and use it. And $300 is a bit more than a lot of people are going to want to spend for a machine so dedicated, especially if you're not going to use it for more than one or two projects in a decade. There are other options. A lot of drill presses actually have attachments that you can convert it over into a hollow chisel mortiser and use it that way. Or you can just grab a drill and drill through it by hand and then clean up the corners and the edges. I tend to do my mortises more along that line. If you're going to do it, go slow. An auger bit is generally a bit better for that, I found, than a spiral bit. And for those who happen to have a bit and brace with the nice cutters on the outside, those are ideal. They'll cut it nice and clean. You got good control. You're going by hand. It's all a question of the tools you have and how comfortable you are doing it. So I will keep going until that is nice and clean. I've gone all the way through, and now I end up with a board that looks like this. I've got holes going through it. I will fit my mortises and my tenons together to make sure that they're going to go through. I want a snug fit. I don't want a tight fit. It should go in without needing a hammer and not needing a whole lot of force behind it. It should just be the thickness of the wood. Partly because you don't want to force the wood and strain it. You can split it. You're also going to be looking at the probability that this is a very, very reactive wood. So as you go to various event sites, inside or outside, your wood can swell, making it even tighter, sometimes tight enough to split, other times just tight enough to make it difficult to take it apart. If you're going to, if you've already got a super tight joint that you need to hammer together, it's going to be almost impossible to get it closed if the humidity goes up, as well as the temperature at an event. Um, there are a few examples that we've got. If you want to go ahead and pull those up now. Of some existing benches that are out there to kind of give you an idea. Both of these benches are inspired by period examples from 15th century. There is a wonderful website on the St. Thomas Guild. They do a lot of examination of furniture from a wide variety of places and times within the SCA context, and all kinds of stuff: chairs, benches, boxes, tables, you name it. But it's a great resource. And if it's not something that you have seen before, it's something well worth going to. Most of these pictures actually came from there.
One second. It was showing. Oh, there it goes. Okay.
So this first one here is based on the same construction premise of the bench that I just showed you. It's got two legs, a top, and the two stretchers going across it, going into slots. You can see that very pronounced there with the amount of grime on the top of it, how that the mortise holes are on the top there. You can see those in there. This one has probably been wedged together. It doesn't break down, would be my guess. It's a little hard to tell from this picture. You can see a better quality one at the St. Thomas Guild, but the sides are actually carved with into low relief, and the actual legs have been carved as well to have some decorative details, as have the, there we go, as have the ends of the stringers, just to give them some, just a little bit more visual appeal to look at. These stringers actually come almost to the end of the board. For my project, I have actually chosen to have them a little bit shorter. So my board for my seat is actually 4 feet even, whereas my stretchers are 3 foot 10 inches. So they're actually set back an inch inside. I just find that it's a little bit easier. I like the aesthetic of it a bit better. It doesn't, it's not sticking out so much so that it's actually bumping into the back of your leg or catching on things if you happen to be straddling the end of it or something going over. Go to the next one. And this one, obviously, this is more of a one person stool or a very short bench.
One moment. I'm having technical difficulties.
One of the other things when you're working on your boards and you're working on your bench is uh, straight edges are nice. They are clean, they are crisp, they are also prone to breakage. They are more likely to ding and catch scuffs and nicks, so it's much more likely that you're going to notice that, but they can also catch and splinter. So most of my projects, I will do what's called breaking the edge. I will either run a hand plane or sanding or a knife or even a chisel, and I'll just take a little bit off the edge just to kind of round it a bit. It protects it a bit, but it also is nice because it's not a sharp edge that digs into you can or catches your clothing. Uh, so it's just kind of one of those little touches. This one you can see here, if you look at the feet, again, they've been cut so they're individual and they're rounded. They're not that 90-degree shoulder. This one has a really nicely carved or cut stretcher. It's taken on some material to give it more visual appeal. This one is cut fairly deeply in the center, and if you're using pine like this, I would avoid making any radical cuts like that. Gradual sweeping arcs, things like that are much better. No points. If you decide to do so, I would not go any more than halfway through the board just to keep the strength of the wood up. When you cut it, again, bundle of fibers, you've just cut that in half. So instead of having a 4-inch thick piece, effectively you've only got the strength of a 2-inch thick piece. This one has a nicely carved stretcher. The top, it's hard to tell if it was intentionally rounded or if it's just been rounded through age and use. But you'll notice the legs are pretty much just straight side. They flare out a little bit at the bottom, but there's not a whole lot of decoration going on there. It's also constructed exactly the same as the one we've been talking about and the stool before it. Yeah, pull up the next one. Now this one's a little bit different. This one, as you can see, has got a much more radical cut. It has nice large sweeping curves on it. You've got a convex and concave curve on the end. It's also a good bit lower than the bench that we've been looking at. But the interesting thing with this one is it's not just chopped off the bottom. That is one solid piece of wood for that stringer that's going down the middle, and it's only a single stringer instead of the two that we've been using. And if you notice the bottom line there, it's actually got the bottom portion of the board still intact. So it actually saves a lot of the strength, but still allows you to take out both some of the weight and also add some visual aspect to it. Some of the things you can do, thank you, is you can do some rather simple stuff. Like on this one here, we've got just a couple of quatrefoils cut out. Get that a little closer so you can kind of see it better. And that is really simply done. That is laid out with some uh, drill bits. I used a fairly large one. I want to say it's about a 3/4 inch drill bit in 4 spots, carefully done. I have a drill press. It makes it a lot easier for that. So I end up with a medieval quatrefoil on it. Just a little bit of visualing. But you can do all kinds of things with these to personalize them. Paint them, stain them your choice, do some decorative cuts, however you want to personally make an impact on your particular project. In this case, I have used a 1x pine board for this particular project. Those stretchers going across it make it nice and sturdy. For the style that I just showed you with the quatrefoil, I don't have those stretchers. I have one on the bottom to keep the legs from racking, but I'm also using much thicker wood. In this case, I'm using 2x material. Again, 2x from your big box store is actually nominal size, so it's actually 1.5 inches thick. But this is fir, and it's construction grade. It's relatively cheap, especially if it's going to be something you're throwing in the back of the truck on the way to an event. The fighters are going to be using to drop things on. The kids are going to be knocking it over in mock battles. You're not really worried about, it getting dinged up and damaged. You're not spent $500 on, a nice piece of figured walnut or oak to actually make something that you're just oohing and awing over. It's a piece of camp furniture that you're not particularly worried about. It's cheap and easy to replace. But again, like I said, I've cut out the bottom. This one has a through tenon for that stringer. The main reason that I changed over the class idea from that style of bench, from this one here, to the one that I showed you, actually has primarily to do with the pegs. There is no reason that the information provided in this material in this class that you could not make this bench just as easily. There's a couple of mortise and tenons in the top. They're just the same. You don't have to do those cuts for the stringers. You don't have to cut the stringers. So in this case, instead of 5 pieces, I've only got 4. However, I now have 2 pegs as well, so technically you have 6. The problem is for a peg to work properly, you need to have that angle cut on it, and it's a little harder to do the angles, and that is something that if you're doing it right, in this particular case, I just drilled through this with the drill press. It's thick enough that I can take my dowel and I can shove it in there, and it'll actually work relatively well for what I'm trying it to do. The problem with that is, since my peg is tapered and my hole is not, that puts a lot of stress on that taper, yeah, and that on that tenon. So it needs to be pretty thick, and these should actually be probably about an inch to an inch and a half longer for what I'm asking them to do. But I made it. It hasn't broken yet. In future iterations, I'll probably make the tenon a bit longer. Um, this angle is a little harder to cut since this is a round dowel. For me, it's just easier to do it that way. I have a tapering jig for my table saw so I can cut them easier. If you decided to do something like this, a square tenon cut through here, or square mortise cut through the tenon, and then a tapered square dowel would be the way you need to go. You want to make sure that when you do it, though, if you notice, that hole is not actually all the way through. Part of it is inside the leg, so that when I drive this wedge in here, it's pulling. It's actually more of the wedge wants to go in there, so it makes a super tight fit. It holds together really well, but the problem is since it's an angle, it actually causes your leg, so instead of your leg to be square to the tenon, it actually wants to cause it to be at an angle. Not a huge one, but it is something to be aware of. The hard part is just cutting that angle on there. It can be done fairly easily with a bit of practice. Using a saw, you can cut your tenon or your pegs for your mortise pretty simply, and it's a matter of then just being cautious with your chisel when you're cutting your mortises through that tenon to get the angle of your peg and the angle of the mortise to actually line up. Not something I wanted to really tackle at this juncture in a introductory class. Um, for materials for this bench, I'm using some 1-inch pine. For the other bench, I'm using 1.5-inch dimensional lumber. The very first ever set of benches that I made on this style of plan, actually I made approximately 15 years ago. And at this point, they're still going strong. I think one of them might have had a stretcher replaced that I don't recall if it was broken or lost, but I want to say it might have been lost. Um, they were made out of actually plywood. It's what we had on hand. They were pretty sturdy, and a good coat of paint on them to seal the wood and protect them from the elements. And they've served quite a few people in the kitchen for a decade and a half. So the lumber you choose, there's a wide variety of stuff you can use. Quite a lot of stuff out there. Some things to avoid: I would not use OSB, oriented strand board. That's the stuff, a lot of people call it plywood, but it's actually composed of chunks of material that are flattened and glued together. So unlike plywood, which is a usually single sheet of very thin wood going one direction with the grain, and then a second layer that is uh, perpendicular to it and back and forth, and a fairly strong material for the weight. OSB doesn't have that strength. It is just small chunks scattered throughout, and it doesn't have really any structural strength. Um, MDF or LDF, which is medium density fiberboard, and low density fiberboard, which is to all intents and purposes glue and sawdust, is also a bad choice. Neither OSB or MDF are structural. So they're going to break down quickly. They're not going to have the strength to support any kind of weight, even painted or polyurethane, anything like that. I would really strongly advise against using them for any kind of a project like this. I know we've had some questions throughout. One of them was talking about blades and power of machines and types of machines. If you are going out and buying a tool particularly for the project, I always recommend buying the best tool that you can get with for what for the project you have at hand. If you're not really sure, you don't know brand names, look for reviews. It's so easy to find them nowadays. Or ask friends if you have woodworking friends. Which brands do they particularly like? Which ones do they not like? Generally, when you're paying for tools, there is a definite point. There's a price break between your home hobbyist and your professional, as far as how long they're going to last, but also in how accurate they are. Certain brands such as Ryobi and Black& Decker tend to be lighter materials. They don't and have the same level of engineering for it. They are geared for people who are going to use them a couple of times a year, and that's perfectly fine. You don't need to get your tolerances within a 64th of an inch, so everything is perfectly so tight and seamless. Um, but as long as they do the job, they'll generally last for you. If you find that they're wearing out on you, maybe it's time to upgrade to something a bit heavier. One of the things, though, is that does not apply the same to consumables such as blades, bits, sanding belts, and things like that. That is where you're generally going to want to put a little bit more money into it. And again, reviews will tell you a lot of things. The difference between a $15 bandsaw blade and a $60 bandsaw blade is not just that I can get four for the price of the other one. A lot of times it is in how accurately the teeth have been set, how sharp the teeth are, whether they're just stamped and called good enough, or if they've actually been sharpened, how well the weld is done on the blade to make it a true band, and if there's a lump on it. I have found quite a few sanding belts for my bench sander that they're cheap, and the glue that they use, they don't change the thickness at all. So instead of having two pieces of material that are a 64th of an inch and a 64th of an inch that are glued to make a 32nd of an inch for the entire thickness of the belt, they don't account for that glue. So now I've got a lump in the middle, which means it's not taking off a uniform amount, but it's also highly aggravating as you're grinding and it's going bump, 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 bump. Um, Also, I mean, all the little details in there. Sanding discs, the $10 for a pack of 100 versus $50 for a pack of 50, and you're going, well, why am I paying, 20 cents for one and a dollar per for the other? You're looking at the type of grit, you're looking at the type of adhesive and how long it lasts, things like that. Do your research on it. Check on the internet, read around, ask around. It's always easier. Some of us, like myself, are stubborn, and I'll still go out and I'll go, "Ooh, that's a good deal," and I'll get back to the house and go, "Yeah, that wasn't such a good deal," because now I'm using instead of paying five for a dollar, and I paid 10 for a dollar, but I'm using seven of them where the one would have worked before. So I'm actually losing money in the process, kind of thing. And it's also inefficient in my time because I have to stop and change out my blade, change out my disc or whatever I'm using, and go from there. Um, there are a number of brands out there that are really reliable. I don't really have a particular brand that I follow exclusively. As you can see, my bandsaw behind me is a Grizzly. I have got a uh, Performax belt sander down here. I've got a Ryobi router table, Delta table saw, rigid drill press. It's really a question of what was a good tool at the price that I could get at the time, as opposed to sticking just to a brand loyalty. Were there any other questions that I didn't answer at this point?
You've pretty much answered all the questions. I would say the one question that you haven't answered is what is the next class going to be about?
Okay. So at current, we're looking at the next class. We're going to go big. We are actually looking at doing a bed for our next class, I believe. There's been a little bit of discussion, but I think I've been informed that that's probably the most useful and most interesting one. We are actually going to be looking at the Oseberg bed. Excuse me, no, the Gokstad bed. It's Gokstad. It's pretty easy to find online. It's a big project. It can look intimidating and kind of daunting, but at this point in time, if you have managed to do a 6 board box and you have figured out how to do a breakdown bench with your mortise and tenon, you have all the skills that you would need to make your very own slat bed to go to and from events. It's primarily it's a mortise and chisel kind of thing, or a mortise and tenon kind of project with some decorative cutting in there. It's more mainly a deal or a question of scope that makes it as intimidating as it is. So I want to
Will they
thank
need
everyone.
any additional tools for that class?
At this point, you should not need any additional tools. Once you have a good chisel to work with, or a couple of them, you've got a mallet, you've got your saw, you should be able to do everything that you need to do on there. Some things that you might want to consider looking into if you've got some money burning a hole in your pocket for these projects and future is you might consider a sanding device of some sort. You can go for, I'm personally fond of random orbit sanders. It's a palm sander, fits in nice compact. It uses sanding discs, and it is called a random orbit because it makes consecutive circles. So it's going, not only is it spinning, but it's spinning as it's spinning. So it helps to alleviate your scratch marks on it. And that'll help remove marks, lines, smooth edges, or rough cuts, or take some of it down. Um, it pretty much is going to be about what you're going to need for this class, other than lumber. And we'll go over what kind of lumber and how, where to look for that lumber, and the amount of lumber you're going to need when we actually get to that class. So, at this point, I think that's about it. I would love to see any of the projects that you guys are coming up with following these. I'm also more than happy to chat if you have any questions about anything that I did not cover on here. And you can find me by going through the links from the class.